Hello, everyone. We are in the last day of the first week of Demand Driven Month. My name is Bruno Acosta, and I will be your host for today's webinar. This webinar is Demand Driven Adaptive Enterprise Model, presented by our thought leader, Carol Ptak. This webinar focuses on the highest level of the Demand Driven model. Carol, it's always a pleasure working with you. The stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I really appreciate being invited to the webinars this week. And I thought it was a good opportunity in this last day of the first week to pull everything together that we've heard in all the webinars this week. So that's why I wanted to take a look at the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. And I want to really focus on the strategic side. So that's a little bit about me. It's my hat I picked up when I was down in Colombia. I treasure that hat. So let's get right into it. Let's bring together everything that we've talked about this week. And let's start with really what is this world that we are trying to manage? And a lot of people, they call it the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. Well, why is it volatile? Well, we really don't know what's really going to happen, and it's very hard to predict. And just in the last year, we can see the kind of rapid changes that we've seen around the world, both government and social and supply chain. It's very interesting now. You can't listen to the news media here in the United States without hearing the word supply chain at least 6 or 7 times. It's uncertain. We know that big disruptions are going to happen, but we don't know where and we don't know what. But the if is pretty certain. We know that we're going to continue to see these kind of disruptions. The other thing that's very interesting is that with all of our technology, we've become more and more connected. So we're much more complex. If you think even just 40 or 50 years ago, it was very uncommon to have suppliers that were not in your country. And it was a big deal in the United States 30, 40 years ago that we would outsource to Mexico. But there was a lot of things that were right at the border. So it was really like an extension of the United States. Now, as we look at our sourcing strategies, we now have truly global companies with global sourcing and global demand. And we have more connections to manage than we ever have had to manage before. And it's very ambiguous. It's very hard to get clarity on what is going on in the world and what direction we're going in. It's really rather like trying to drive in the rain with no windshield wipers. We really can't tell in this picture. We could be in Mexico City. We could be in Seattle, Washington. We could be in Paris. We just don't know because we don't have that clarity of vision. So as we're trying to manage this new normal, let's call it the new normal, this is now our everyday opportunity. So what is that new normal for supply chain? Well, compare back to 1965, you can see that on many components, we are in absolutely an opposite state today. Now, why is 1965 so important? Well, that's because that's when all of our rules, all of our tools, all of our methodologies were developed. Because if you think about it, things were really starting to develop in the 50s with the advent of the computer. And then we started to really come together and codify it in the 60s. And by the 70s, we'd commercialized it. And everything is still done the same way today as it was done in 1965. I still have my original MRP book that we all studied from for our certification exams from the mid-70s. So that's our world, and it's the opposite of what we had seen before. But now let's take this up to the strategic level. Let's look at what risks that we have to figure out how we're going to manage. So we've got a collapse risk. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that something changed that renders our entire firm's business model obsolete. Let me give you a very personal example. In March of 2020, I was in Bogota, Colombia, teaching a demand-driven leader class. By the time I got home, 2 things happened. One, I didn't realize it as I left the airport that night that I was on the very last flight from Colombia to the United States when Colombia closed her borders. Had I not been on that flight, I would have been in Colombia enjoying Colombian coffee for the next 7 weeks. And when you're in the middle of a crisis, obviously you want to go home. But I would have been there for 7 weeks because it just closed down with no warning. When I got home, what I quickly realized is that a calendar that was absolutely booked through the end of the year all of a sudden just started to evaporate. And I watched as our whole educational model changed. No longer could we do face-to-face classes. We all had to figure out how to pivot and adapt and be able to deliver classes in a virtual setting, in which we all did. We had to survive. So that change just rendered our entire business model obsolete. And you really have two choices. You either change or you're not going to survive. And we've seen, unfortunately, a number of businesses that were not capable of shifting quickly enough during the pandemic, and they no longer exist. And I think we're going to see a lot more as we continue to evolve into whatever this new normal is. We also have a contagion where a shock in one part of the business spreads to other parts of the business. And if you think about it, what's going on today with the shortage of microprocessors, well, you think of a shortage of microprocessors in one area is affecting the entire car industry in the United States. So it's a very interesting thing where you have a shock in one area, and now you're affecting a very, very large part of your supply chain network. The third, this is one of the ones we're living through right now, is a very rare, but a very large shock, like a natural disaster, like what hit Japan with the tsunami, or terrorism as it hit the United States on 9/11, or political turmoil. Well, we don't need many examples of that around the world, but it's rare. But these things happen and send a huge shockwave. The pandemic itself could be considered a fat tail risk. Notice how these risks are interrelated. Because of that fat tail risk, we then saw collapse because that fat tail risk of the pandemic so quickly changed the environment around us as governments shut down in an attempt to mitigate the rollout of that virus. Now, there's also a discontinuity risk, as we look at the business environment, and it can evolve abruptly in ways that are very difficult to predict. And this is where we're at today. It was interesting as the pandemic started to hit and countries started to close down. I talked to a lot of executives and they said, well, once we get through this and get back to normal. And it was a very interesting conversation because it was like, guys, it's never going to be the same way it was on December 2019. We're never going to go back to that day. Is that we're in a new world and you need to figure out how it is that you're going to compete in this new normal. So we've got this discontinuity risk that the business environment, none of this was on anybody's strategic plan. That our whole business environment just evolved very abruptly and it was not predicted. And the obsolescence risk. If you think about how the changes in consumer behavior, not to continue to pick on the pandemic, but it's a very good example how a fat tail risk can also invoke some of the other risks that we need to be concerned about. You think about now the number of restaurants that still only offer takeout, that now groceries, this is one of my favorites, I'm actually glad they do this, is that I can order all my groceries online and somebody else goes up and down the grocery aisle to pick all my groceries, and then I just pull up with my car and they bring them out. I like that. So that's a good thing for me. But if the enterprise fails to adapt to those changing consumer needs, then they're going to go obsolete. And it was interesting as the grocery stores here in the United States started to offer this contactless pickup, that it looks like now, these companies are starting to incorporate this. Well, it's part of their normal business practice, because if you think about it, it's a great way for them to appeal to the segment of the market like me that really hates to go grocery shopping. And then finally, rejection risk. As we look at participants in that business ecosystem, you can call this the cancel culture, which is very strong here in the United States. This is where a company worries about social media and the impact of how a situation is handled and how that company could be rejected. The latest being how Coca-Cola and Nike were moved the games out of Atlanta, Georgia, because they didn't like how the Georgia election law was going. Well, and both companies saw a dramatic decrease in the demand for their product. And it's been very interesting to watch as these companies are starting to walk back their previous political positions. So, or if we look at United Airlines, when that was around the world, everybody knew about that, is that they carried that passenger off that plane. In United, I don't know if they'll ever recover in reputation from that. So as we look at these strategic risks that we need to consider, we're trying to consider these risks, and we're in this VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. So, well, how do we move forward? It's seemingly overwhelming that how it is that we need to manage our companies in the face of all these risks, in the face of this VUCA world. Well, let's start with the first assumption. Leaders must start with the assumption that big disruptions are going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So when big disruptions will happen. Second, we cannot build business and supply chain models that are based on any kind of profit maximization strategy that ignores the above conclusion. And it was very interesting. I was reading an article that was published by, I think it was Apex El Paso, and it actually came out of ASEM Chicago. And they were talking about how companies that previously had been very lean in their inventory, the automotive industry, and what they've noticed is that these companies are starting to decouple themselves from some of their supply base. Why? Well, because they recognize that having zero inventory, remember when JIT was called zero inventory or just in time, well, that's great if there's no variability. But if there's variability, then I have to be able to mitigate that kind of variability in my supply chain. So it was a very interesting article that came out of ASEM about how all these industries are now starting to decouple themselves from certain problem area suppliers. And this is a huge change because the idea of decoupling from a strategic basis determines my customer lead time and my inventory investment. So as we go into this, we understand that the big discussion now is this idea of resilience, is how do we gain supply chain resilience? And there's really two sides of this that we need to be concerned about. One side is how robust our supply chains are, and the second is how resilient. Now, the robustness of the supply chain is how much pressure can it take before it breaks? And if we really think about it, supply chains are really not chains. We actually called it the wrong thing. All right, we had a perspective in operations where an operational flow went from raw materials to finished goods. And we said, well, we're part of a chain. We can go back to our customer's customer and we can go forward to our supplier's supplier. Well, the reality is that when you start to do that, you've created something that's a network, not a chain. So that's why as we look at that complexity in the VUCA world, it's those connections that are the thing that makes supply chain very difficult. If it was a chain, it would be easy because as we all know, the strength of the chain is its weakest link. But as we look at a network, now we've got multiple points of contact with multiple connections. And when one connection breaks, the whole thing just doesn't disintegrate. It adapts because supply chains have never been chains. Even when we named it supply chain, it was never a chain. It is a complex adaptive system. So it's web-like. It's something that doesn't stay in any steady state too long. It's something that as soon as any kind of pressure is on it, it shifts and it morphs. So we need to have tools that allow us to manage this kind of thing and do it with a goal of resilience. So what is resilience? It's that ability to maintain or restore system equilibrium through or after large shocks. And companies today are really being schooled on this idea of resilience because the world dramatically changed in the last year. But the question has got to be, how do I do that? Is it magic? Are some companies just lucky? Or is there really a methodology? Is there a blueprint? Can I follow a well-established pathway that will allow my company to build a supply chain that's both robust and resilient? So, but first, let me give you a warning. The warning is that as we start to focus in this post-COVID-19 world, which we're in today, is that management cannot focus on unit cost. That is key. Management cannot focus on unit cost to build that supply chain strategy. As our General Akbar would say, it's a trap. Okay? It's a trap. It's not about trying to reduce unit cost. It's about improving the robustness, the resiliency of our overall supply chain. So, well, why is it that cost is such a bad thing? Well, it really jeopardizes resilience. And you can see some of the things that happens here. You can see some of the crazy things that as we focus on the wrong idea that we can cause really big problems. So cost strategies, this whole idea of cost strategy depends on very predictable and consistent volume to attempt to maximize profit, which means that nothing can go wrong. And you can see in these pictures here, there's lots of stuff going wrong. So the whole idea, this is what we're seeing with the automotive companies and the companies that did just in time, is that they're starting to decouple because they recognize that they are no longer in a predictable and a consistent environment. So cost strategies are always dependent on this idea that things just continue to flow and things just never have a problem from what we had before. Now, the issue is that when we have the volume not being realized, there's really three bottom line effects. One, we end up with too much of the wrong stuff because we're building what it is that we think the market's going to take, and then they don't take it because we've got that volatility and variability in the market. We've got that uncertainty. We also have too little of the right. We don't have what it is that the customer wants. You know, and as we watch the grocery stores to see what they had and what they didn't have as the pandemic rolled out last year. And of course, you know, the big joke around the world, the Americans immediately did a major run on toilet paper. And then the news media tried to convince us that we didn't have shortages because of hoarding, is that we had shortages because of the difference in supply chains, producing toilet paper for offices and industrial use versus producing toilet paper for consumer use. Well, if you believe that story, I got some waterfront property here in Arizona that I can sell you. You know, so we ended up with too little of the right. So we did not have what we needed. And I told my husband as we watched the grocery stores, I said, watch, the fresh goods will come back first. You know, first things that we're going to get back is going to be produce and eggs and things like that. And sure enough, well, why? Well, those suppliers are local. Okay, it's a very close to consumption production. So yes, we get some of our fruit from Mexico and Chile and all that, but you know, those fresh goods tended to come back faster than some of the other goods. For example, we could not buy tapioca because of the shortage in Brazil and the pandemic in Brazil, and it was about a year before we could buy a box of tapioca here. It's crazy when you start to understand the supply chains and how it is that they push through to the end consumer. So without a doubt, we ended up with too much of the wrong, too little of the right, and companies going absolutely crazy trying to attempt to correct and bring it to the marketplace with what the customer really wanted to buy. Now, what ends up happening is that because we're so focused on cost unit minimization, that we are fundamentally misaligning our assets to the market demand. So we're utilizing assets as opposed to delivering what the customer really wants. Now, when we do that, we've wasted the company's resources. And the larger the disruption, the worse the misalignment. And I know every one of you in this on this call have many, many examples of some of the things that you just shake your head and you go, are we crazy? Because as we watched, it was very interesting to then watch the grocery stores put things on sale with tremendous sales that you couldn't get. You know, flour, for example. We couldn't get flour. And then they put flour on sale and you go, hold it, you're already short. Why would you put it on sale and I can't get it anyway? So we've had this huge misalignment in the strategic management of the companies. And the bigger the misalignment, I'm sorry to tell you, is you're lower the chance of your survival. We cannot continue to put blinders on and continue to build what we think the market can and will consume. We need to figure out how to align our assets so that we can build what the customer indeed can and will buy. This is a tremendous shift in the strategy for a company. So let's look at the strategic metrics. You know, what are the organization's vital signs? You know, if you think about it, as you go into the hospital or go into the doctor's office, the first thing they do is they take your pulse, they look at your blood pressure, they see how many times you're breathing, they take your temperature. That's a human vital sign. But our organization also has vital signs as well, and these are the strategic metrics. Well, the strategic metrics help us understand overall how a company is doing. All right, so we have things called working capital. Well, what's working capital? Well, that's really money that's trapped in the business. It's our inventory, that's our cash, their credit. All right, so this is what we have invested in the business. And if I look at my contribution margin, then it's my rate of cash generation. Now, one of my dearest friends was like a brother to me. It was Ellie Goldratt. And Ellie did a great job of convincing the world that the goal is to make money. Well, if I ask you and say, okay, if that's your overall number one strategic metric, and I made $1 million this year, did I do well? Well, and everybody, well, well, it depends. Well, what does it depend on? Well, it depends on how much money you got invested in the business. Well, of course it does. And if you go back and reread the goal, you'll see that insight. So we need to understand how much money have we got trapped in the business. So really, the objective is making money, true, but it's measured in terms of return on investment. And return on investment is our net profit divided by the investment. So it's both profitability and how much resource I had to invest. Because if I made $1.2 million and I had $500,000 invested, you can see where my ROI is much higher than if I made a profit of $1.2 million and had $10 billion invested. Well, you can see that in the first case, that's a much better position to be in. So we need those two numbers. So as we strategically direct our business, working capital and contribution margin are critical. One is resources trapped in the enterprise. The other is a rate. It's a rate of generation of cash. A company can be profitable based on generally accepted accounting practice and go out of business because it is holding too much cash in the business and it simply runs out of cash. And we've all run into this, and a lot of small companies had this issue during the pandemic, is that, their big customers weren't paying them. For some reason, I don't know why the big companies thought it'd be okay to not pay their little suppliers, but we saw that across our entire affiliate network, is that they weren't getting paid. It wasn't that they weren't owed, it's they just weren't getting paid. So as we look at cash flow, it's critical, just as critical as we look at net profit, so that working capital and contribution margin are directly related to each other. And of course, what's the third leg? We need 3 legs to stand on here, because that's the stable way to stand, is when you get 3 points. Well, it's customer base, right? What is it? It's all about the customer. We don't have a business unless we have a customer. When I was teaching at the university, I always taught my students that your only source of sustainable competitive advantage was to provide value to the customer at a profit to yourself. And you did that by exploiting your unique operational capability. That's it. That's the only thing that's sustainable, is what is it that's unique about you that provides value to your customer at a profit to you. Then that's a win-win, and that way you can continue. So the customer base is our market share. It's our sales, it's our service, how well our quality of our products are. And this is what differentiates us. So this customer base is critical, and you can see where these 3 strategic metrics work together. Notice how the 3 never come together. They're not directly in the middle, but there's a green zone, a yellow zone, a red zone, and a dark red zone. Well, that's because things don't stay static. Things change. And what happens is metrics will start to float to the edge of chaos. Without being managed, things will go to some kind of chaos and collapse. Active management is required on the strategic metrics to keep them where we want them to be. Because what happens is that as those metrics start to move to the edge of chaos and collapse, we start to realize that we've got a problem. And then it's all hands on deck trying to solve the problem before we go into insolvency and collapse. So that position of those metrics, although they never touch each other, they are absolutely connected to each other. And as they move, it guides the actions of the company. And as things move to that outer edge, then we get alarms intensify. And we saw a lot of this over the past year, because all of a sudden companies were continuing to produce and they had too much in working capital. The customer base changed forever. And how is it that we have affected our contribution margin? So Now, I mentioned earlier about complex adaptive systems. Well, why do we call them complex? Not because they're complicated. Those are two different words. Complex means that they are non-linear, means that there's dynamic interactions and very high degrees of interdependence across a multidimensional structure. So these are multi-echelon, multi-dimensional connections across our supply chain. So this is the epitome, this is the absolute opposite of a linear chain. Well, when we have that kind of connection, we have that kind of network, we have now extreme sensitivity. So we've got lots of small things occurring in a short time frame, means that produces very significant nonlinear outcomes. Okay, and I think many of you have heard the comments called the butterfly effect. You know, a butterfly flaps its wings in India, and there's a tornado that happens in the Gulf of Mexico. But it happens in our environments of our supply chain. Very small changes, like for example, as they started to build titanium into tennis shoes and to tennis rackets and golf clubs, that created a worldwide shortage in titanium, which then affected the aerospace industry and affected the ability to be able to even build an aircraft. So you wouldn't think that a tennis racket could affect an airplane, but it has. So there's a very disproportionate cause and effect. So a part that costs 10 cents, as we all know, can halt an assembly. This is why I love when people say ABC. Well, the C parts are less important. Really? That little 10-cent part can stop that $500,000 assembly just as fast as a $10,000 part. Now, this isn't new. This came out and was first documented in the book, Demand-Driven Performance Using Smart Metrics, 7 years ago. That was in 2014. Now, why adaptive? Adaptive refers to how this system changes. One of the things of a linear system, as we look at the metrics, the strategic metrics of a linear system, that behavior of a linear system is rather predictable. As I put in more input, I get more output. I can mathematically optimize it. This is the basis of all the attempts for advanced planning and scheduling, or advanced planning and optimization, is to try to take into account all the components to come up with an optimized answer. Well, here's the problem. Supply chains cannot be optimized because they don't stay in any steady state too long. And what happens is, as soon as I start to put any pressure on, they change. Well, how do they change? They change through a series of three things, which is the emergence, selection, and feedback. So something new comes out, either a new idea or new capability. Then the market says yes or no. You know, it's just like I was talking earlier about the grocery stores that now do pick your groceries for you. And then you can just wheel in, call them when you get there, they bring it out, and they stick it in the back of your car, all paid for, all done. All right, well, that's a good selection. The market liked it, so the stores are keeping it. And then the feedback, it's that process of signals and triggers that are monitored by what are called adaptive agents. Those adaptive agents are people. Those are people that are making decisions on the strategy of the company. So the system is adapting by new ideas, selection, and feedback. Now, this isn't new. This is something that came out of biology. You know, one of my dreams is, before I die, one of my bucket list items is I want to go to Ecuador. I want to go down where Charles Darwin did all his work with the finches and the Galapagos Island. That's always been my dream, is to get down there and understand how they understood that theory of adaptation. Now, a lot of people said that Darwin said theory of evolution. He never did. He always talked about the theory of adaptation, of how is it that new things emerged. And in nature, that selection is really rather cataclysmic. You either live or die. And then that feedback. So as we start to monitor our organizations and look at our strategic metrics, it's understanding that emergence, selection, and feedback. So we have to have some way to be able to select how is it that we are going to move forward. All right, how do we get that feedback loop? So as we look at the success factors, the key attribute in complex adaptive systems from a strategic perspective is getting the system into coherence. All right, so that, what does that mean? Well, it means that our subsystems are in alignment with the overall system objective. Well, that's interesting, because we know that a lot of companies struggle with this and have departmentalized behavior, or what we call organizational silos. So how do we manage this complex adaptive system? Well, first, we have to have this idea of a boundary. Now, all systems are interconnected. We're all connected to each other, but there's a limit to our effective management. You know, as I always tell managers, affect what you can control. So we need to understand that edge of chaos. Where's that zone between equilibrium, which is where we want to be, and total collapse? So where is that? And then the signals. How do we get the metrics so that we can see the feedback of how things are going? And how strong is that signal? It's not just a matter of green light, yellow light, red light. It's got to be, how far into the red am I? How far into the yellow am I? You know, it's sort of like, you know, as you look at your speed, you know, just because you're 2 miles over, well, is that good or bad? Well, most police officers won't stop you for 2 miles over. And then the feedback loops. What is the mechanism to judge our performance? What are those specific measures that give us the information that we need? And the adaptive agents, the people trained to understand the measures. Now, you know, everybody always likes to say that, you know, how you measure me is how I will behave. Well, okay, but do the people that are being measured understand the metric? Right? I can only change behavior if they understand the context of the metric. So what's the success factor? Well, it gets right back to resilience. We want our system, our supply chain, our company to have that ability to maintain or restore equilibrium through a big shock. So coherence, let's go back to that. Coherence on what? Well, I would submit to you that our coherence has to be focused on flow. It's all about flow. So let's go back to George Plazel, one of the fathers of MRP. You never heard George speak that he did not say all benefits directly related to the speed of flow. Well, and I'm giving you the traditional view of the supply chain here, and the supply chain flows. We know information flows backwards through a supply chain. Materials and information flow forwards through the supply chain, and cash flows backwards through the supply chain. And what George is saying is that all benefits are directly related to that speed of flow. When I have good flow, what happens? Well, I have good service. All right. So when I have service, then that tends to maximize and protect my revenue. Well, if I maximize and protect my revenue, then that minimizes my inventory. Right? So now this is really critical, because if we look at in terms of service and revenue, now I'm telling you that you can have better service and better revenue and less inventory. Well, that's in direct conflict to the idea that's out there that to have better customer service, I have to have more inventory. That's the basis of every stochastic inventory safety stock model that's out there that says better customer service comes at the expense of more inventory. And what I'm telling you is that's what's called the deep truth. Just because everybody believes it doesn't make it true. And actually, it's false. As I have better flow, I have better service and lower inventories at the same time. And the other thing that goes down is, let's get back to cost, because we spend a lot of time, money, and effort trying to fix things. Well, when we try to fix things, all right, that's waste. That's nothing that our customer really wants to pay for. We're trying to cover up our company's inability to be able to sense changes in the marketplace, adapt our planning, and innovate to what the real needs of the market are. And when we have good flow, we obviously get very good cash flow. And so cash flow follows the rate of product flow to the market demand. So the overall strategic metric is that's all about ROI. And if I protect and promote flow, I will maximize return on investment. Well, let's explain flow. Remember, I can only improve it if I measure it. And as I improve flow, I improve cash velocity. As I improve cash velocity, I'm going to improve ROI. How do we define it? Flow is the rate at which a system, okay, this complex adaptive system, is going to convert material to product required by a customer. Again, not pushing the utilization of our resources away from market demand, but directly tying the utilization of our resources directly to market demand. That's where we're going to get our best flow. And our cash velocity is our rate of net cash generation. How do I define that? Well, let's look at managerial accounting. That's revenue minus variable cost. Okay, it's also known as contribution margin. Now, in the theory of constraints world, that's also known as throughput. But we also have to subtract our period operating expense. How much cash did we use to continue to exist during this same time period? And then net profit divided by investment is, and always has been, the equation for return on investment. Now, how do we quantify flow? Well, let's get into Little's Law. Quantifying flow says my throughput, in other words, my units per day times my lead time is my work in process. So if I do 5 a day and I have a 10-day lead time, I've got 50 units in work in process. Well, we can play around with that equation, and we can see that to reduce lead time, a very easy way to do that is reduce your work in process. And that ties back to flow and our company vital signs. Flow is a direct contributor to all 3 of those strategic metrics. The better the flow, the less working capital that I have trapped in my company. The better the flow, the better the contribution margin that I have, because I'm directly tying my resources to what it is that the customer really wants to buy. And the better the flow, the bigger the customer base that I've got. And so the better things flow, the less waste I have in the system, which means that my costs are lower. So it's very interesting. Here we've been all focused on unit cost, and really what we should be focused on is flow. If I focus on flow, then costs will be minimized. If I focus on cost, I will destroy flow. And in effect, I will increase cost in the process. So it's an interesting dilemma. It's an interesting dichotomy. It also seems incredibly obvious, but if it's so obvious, then why is it so difficult? Well, we got to be missing something. So let's talk about the strategic side. As we look at flow, public enemy number 1 of flow, variability. And that's what we have had over and over again in this past year is variability. The difference between what we thought was going to happen and what actually happened. I had to laugh. Somebody here threw a birthday party for our 1st year anniversary of the 2-week shutdown. You know, they convinced us all if we just closed down for 2 weeks, then we could emerge and everything would be fun. And I kept telling everybody, guys, a pandemic is not a forest fire. I live in an area that we do have very serious forest fires. And in forest fires, once the fire has gone by you, it doesn't come back and get you again. But a pandemic is not a forest fire, right? That virus is always out there. So we have a lot of variability. As I can reduce variability, then I can improve flow. Conversely, as I have more variability, then I reduce flow. Well, how do I mitigate variability? We do that with visibility. Well, what is visibility? Visibility is defined as relevant information for making decisions. As I have better visibility, I can mitigate variability. If I have worse visibility, then I've got increased variability. As I mentioned, I live in Arizona, which is a state in the United States that's in the Southwest. It's well known for being hot here because Phoenix is here. But Arizona is an interesting place because it's got a big change in altitudes. If you go to where the Grand Canyon is, which is also in Arizona, it's about 9,000 feet of elevation. It snows up there. Where I live, I'm at about 5,000 feet of elevation, and it snows here too. One day I was coming home a couple months ago, and I was driving home in the middle of a snowstorm, and all of a sudden, I had a cataclysmic failure on my car. I had hit something. And I loved it when I went to church on Sunday, and somebody says to me, well, did you see what you hit? I said, if I had the visibility to see what I hit, I wouldn't have hit it. So as we have better visibility, we can mitigate that kind of variability. So if I could have seen what was in the road, trust me, I would have swerved around it. All right, because it actually tore a hole in my tire that was about 4 inches long and about 2 inches wide. And whatever I hit so hard that it actually cracked the wheel. Now, here I am on a dark road in the snow and ice having to change a tire. Not a lot of fun. If I had been able to see it, I would have avoided it. And it's the same way with our companies today. Many companies have had to stop on the side of the road and change the equivalent of a flat tire because they didn't see some of the changes that are coming at them. So our question becomes, how do we gain visibility to relevant information in this new crazy world to best manage the flow? Well, there's 4 essentials for distilling relevant information. The first is defining relevant range. Second is defining a flow-based operating model. Third, how do we reconcile between those models? And fourth, how do we get the metrics? And I spent some time talking already about the strategic metrics, which is really the focus for this presentation. So the first is relevant range. Well, what's relevant range? That's the time frame where our assumptions are valid. Because understand, the assumptions that are valid near term are very different than the assumptions that are valid way out in the future. When I force fit irrelevant assumptions into the wrong range, I distort information. For example, my friend, the forecast. Absolutely relevant, necessary for our tactical and strategic time frame. However, devastating for our operational time range. All right, tying our order release to a forecast is devastating and will guarantee that our company will build too much of the wrong stuff, too little of the right stuff. We also need to understand that our fixed costs are fixed in the short and the long. Our fixed costs are fixed in the short term, but in the long run, they're variable. So work orders, I care about them in the short term, not the long term. Here's the problem. It's like we're speaking different languages, not just Spanish and English and French and German. We're speaking 2 different languages because of where we're focused. Operational people are focused in the very near term, and what they're seeing here in this picture is rolling hills. The strategic metrics, we're looking out in those craggy mountains and trying to figure out how we're going to get over those mountains. And people don't talk the same language. They don't realize that they're talking about different relevant ranges. We also must have a flow-based operating model. Now, this is nothing new. You know, we lived through JIT, we lived through Lean, Theory of Constraints, Dr. Goldratt, George Plazel, Taiichi Ohno, Dr. Deming. I mean, we've known about the need for flow from economics and mathematics and physics, managerial accounting. These ideas have all been around since, wow, the 1800s. But there's very specific ways to design that flow-based operating model. There's the innovation. It's very different if I'm in a make-to-stock business, like the company on the top, or if I'm in a mixed mode business. No 2 companies are going to have the same flow-based operating model. The positioning, the sizing, and the dynamic adjustment of these decoupling points is going to be unique to the company. And it will change as the company works through its environment. We also need a tactical reconciliation. How is it that strategy is affected by operations and operations is affected by strategy? And I said those are 2 different relevant ranges. And we need to reconcile the assumptions, not aggregate and disaggregate, reconcile. And we need 2 reconciliations. We need the tactical reconciliation and we need a strategic integrated reconciliation. And so this has to happen in a very constant, not batch. It's a constant bidirectional iterative process. Strategy's got to be impacted by our operational capability, and operational capability has to be impacted by strategy. It was interesting to me when I was teaching at the university, they would not allow me to teach strategy because they said I was not qualified, because I insisted that strategy had to be operationalized. You just didn't get to dream big dreams and then say somewhere a miracle occurs. To me, strategy has to be connected to the operationalization. How is it? What's step 1? What's step 2? How do we get to that future desired reality? Now, flow-based metrics. Any suite of metrics has got to take into account the other 3 things: the relevant range, the bidirectional tactical reconciliation, and this idea of relevant information. So they got to fit the range. It has to fit that flow-based operating model, and it has to be reconcilable. When we attempt to force fit cost-focused metrics, that leads to distortion, it leads to conflict, it leads to oscillation, and it leads to disaster, because we're putting our people in a no-win, what's called a double bind. We're making our people choose the least worst choice. So let's wrap up with the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. It's 3 pieces. What happens is out of adaptive S&OP, which is handling the strategic relevant range, we're getting the parameters of the business plan, a range, an expected number, an optimistic number, a pessimistic number. But we have to cross that chasm. We've got to connect strategy to operation, and that's done by DDS&OP. DDS&OP is a tactical bidirectional reconciliation. What comes out is how we build that demand-driven operating model. What are the master settings that we need? Well, this also has to be closed loop. As I'm now setting these master settings, I'm getting a range of capability. Expected, upper spec limit, lower spec limit. I can compare that to my upper control limit and my lower control limit. So I'm getting my variance. What did I plan? What did I actually get? And then that allows me through DDS&OP to then go back and evaluate the different scenarios and the assumptions that are coming out of the strategic plan for the business, so that we know that the scenario that we select is not only feasible, but it's optimal. It's going to give us the kind of return on investment that we need. So the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model, I love listening to the discussion. They say, is it left to right or right to left? Well, it's both. Is it outside in or inside out? Both. So it allows us to connect actual demand to the resources that we have, while at the same time driving forward to the strategy of where the company wants to go through the innovation in the marketplace. So does it have relevant range? Yes. Operationally is handled by the DDOM, tactical by DDS&OP, strategic by adaptive S&OP. Does it have, as we look at these relevant ranges, we can see that DDS&OP overlaps the demand-driven operating model. Adaptive S&OP is not as long as strategic planning, but longer than the business plan. Right? The business plan is typically annualized. The flow-based operation model. Well, it combines critical elements of all these things. It's not about or. It's having the ability to take demand, actual demand, through strategically placed decoupling points and managing control points. And we have to manage those with buffers. Okay, just like, the article I just read this morning is that these industries that had previously viewed inventory as evil are discovering that those decoupling points are necessary to get the resilience they need in their supply chain. So flow-based operation, there's our little friend DDMRP. A lot of people act like that's the end state. It's not. It's the first step. So we take actual demand into our supply order generation engine called DDMRP, and out comes our purchase orders and stock transfer orders, our manufacturing orders. Now, those manufacturing orders go out to some kind of a finite control point scheduling. It could be a drum buffer rope scheduler. It could be a process flow scheduler. It could be a rhythm wheel scheduler. It could be an optimization scheduler, whatever makes you happy. But it's only finitely controlled at the control point. We get the promise dates back. We get our buffer statuses back. And of course, we've got to monitor the progression of our work orders. Now, that's overseen by this tactical integrated reconciliation, right? This DDS&OP. And how is it that we get the emergence, selection, and feedback from the flow-based operating model through the tactical integrated reconciliation team back through DDS&OP? Now, that tactical reconciliation has to be bidirectional. And there's a few things that we do here. We look at a tactical review. How did the comparison of our operations compare to the capability that we established? What's the projection? As we look in the near term, within the cumulative lead time, how can we project model performance? The reconciliation, how are we going to adapt the model based on that information that's coming into us? And then, do I have an ability to do tactical exploitation where I have capacity that is available in the near term? And then finally, what about my strategic recommendations? What is my idea for my better model that I can't do as a DDS&OP team, but I need the exec's approval for it. So I've got to reconcile my demand-driven operating model with my sales and operations planning. Let's tie this together, and then I'll open up for questions. Well, as we look at our forecast, all good forecasts should have three numbers. There's expected, optimistic, conservative. Well, if we go high, we need safety, right? Well, what comes out of that forecast is a single number of an ADU. That ADU, or in Spanish, CPD, goes into the master settings, and what comes out is a buffer. Now, the interesting thing is with a single ADU, we get this buffer, but the buffer gives us a range of capability. So that's why it's really not all that important how accurate that ADU is, because we always end up with a range of capability. So it allows us to compare the range, okay, the safety that's embedded in the buffer with the safety that's required. We also have the potential excess. Well, we know if our demand drops to 0 overnight, we have a maximum inventory exposure because DDMRP only replenishes when things are consumed, not like the master schedule that'll have you continue to build things that you don't need. So if demand is higher, the buffers have safety. If demand is lower, we've got a limit on our stock exposure. We can compare these ranges to ensure that our capability range is equal to or greater than the requirement from sales and operations planning. We can also do the same for capacity. S&OP is not about supply-demand balancing. It is management's handle on the business to ensure that our capability meets the market requirements. So let's wrap it up. The tactical reconciliation really drives this adaptation. So you see here these circles of the emergence, selection, and feedback loop. DDS&OP is that piece in the middle where it drives both adaptive loops. So we've got a tactical adaptive loop and a strategic adaptive loop. Let's finish up with the metrics. Metrics, operational. What do I start doing, stop doing, or continue doing? It's that simple. Tactical metrics. How do I manage my operation with process control as opposed to transaction control? And then back to the strategic metrics that we've already discussed. Notice the connection between each of the metrics, and we've given you the metric objectives here. Remember, the objectives have to fit the range, support the flow-based operating model, understand the relevant ranges, and have to be reconcilable. All right, so in conclusion, the demand-driven operating model, well, it's built for complex adaptive systems. The subsystem behavior is in alignment with the overall system objective, and that system objective is all about flow. So the boundaries, we get those from the relevant range. The edge of chaos, that's because of the red, yellow, green zones used throughout the demand-driven methodology. The signals, people love it. They're highly intuitive, very visual. The signal strength, we have color first, percentage second. We have feedback loops. There's multiple feedback loops throughout the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model, and the adaptive agents, for the first time in their careers, are actually getting relevant, actionable information so they can make good choices for the company. And what we're building is a well-defined, resilient enterprise that's highly robust. That was the other calls that we got as the pandemic started to roll out, is companies calling us up saying, the buffers are holding, the buffers are holding. Well, yeah, that's what they're there for, is to absorb variability. So how do we get started? First is understanding where we are today. And most companies are trapped with cost and flow and conflict. Second, take that step to flow. This is where DDMRP is. This is where the start is. Then expand it to a full demand-driven operating model. Incorporate sales and operations planning, both DDS&OP first, and then adaptive S&OP. And then what happens is you come up to the top level of the ability of the company to strategically sense, adapt, and innovate across the supply chain. And now the focus is how do we continually improve ROI? And this is a mature demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. But my last word, my thinker here, what's the way to start? I can't stress this enough. invest in your people. Invest in people's ability to think and problem solve systemically. Because if you can't think systemically, then you can't resolve these distortions to relevant information, which means that if you can't do that, you're incapable of thinking for flow. That's the overall top strategic metric. It's all about flow. And ensuring and maintaining a framework, well, for those 4 prerequisites to give that relevant information, well, that's the primary job of senior management. That's what senior management is there for. So there's more detail available if you're interested. This book came out a few years ago. It's in English and Spanish, and it's available, which gives more detail about the overall strategic view of the demand-driven adaptive enterprise. I want to thank our demand-driven Latin America for inviting me today. And if we have any questions, you feel free to ask those in the text box. If you want to ask them in Espanol, that's fine. Lo siento mucho, hablo inglés solamente, but I've got my Latin team on with me and they can translate. So if you're not feeling confident to ask the question in English, please go ahead and ask it in Spanish. Bruno, Alex, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Kara. I'm going to stop the recording our presentation